Hello again. Today I would like to go with the introductory materials that have to do with how law is created, how the government functions, what the Constitution is, basic building blocks that some of which apply directly to business organizations and corporate law, others do not. But there are things that you really should know. And personally, I feel these are things you all should have been taught in eighth grade civics, but my experience over the years has been to see that most of you were not. Those of you who have had constitutional law courses, this will be old material to you. And those of you who have had my classes in the past, we have gone over this in each of the courses that I teach. I'd urge you to still go through, read the notes, listen to this lecture, because I will be trying to address these items, particularly in reference to business law and to business organizations as we go through this. The handouts that I'm going to be working with, first of all, is one that has to do with the Constitution. It's a very brief outline of the constitutional setup for the structure of our government. When the Constitution was first enacted, there had previous to that point in time been the 13 former British colonies that became independent states once the Revolutionary War was won. The British Army and Navy withdrew from North America, and now you had what had formerly been 13 dependent entities, 13 dependent states or colonies that needed Britain for their military and naval protection, that followed British trade and were part of the British Empire, being able to buy and sell and move their goods throughout the empire. Now we're effectively 13 very small, independent, and fairly weak republics. Many people in the states realized that this would not work, that they ran the risk of being conquered by France or Spain or England if they tried to remain as small, independent entities. And so, therefore, they attempted to form a unified government for the 13 former colonies. There were a couple of variations of that were not really successful, and then finally they called a convention where the states sent delegates, and the delegates argued over the course of a very long hot summer in Philadelphia without the benefit of air conditioning or ice to put in your drinks. And they came up with a plan for a united government. The first three articles of the Constitution deal almost exclusively with how this government is set up. And it has become so much a part of the culture, of the lore, of just the popular perception that most people don't even think about this anymore. When I say the Constitution, most people, what they first think of is the Bill of Rights, where our individual rights such as freedom of the press, freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, the Fifth Amendment rights, and all the other criminal law rights are placed. That's what most people think of, because those are actually some of the ones that affect us most dramatically in our daily lives, and they're also ones that are constantly being tested and challenged. And over the last 50 years, the courts have done an incredible job of expanding those rights and explaining those rights in very many cases. So that's what usually gets into the news, and that's what's in people's popular perception. The constitutional setup of the government has been so stable for so long that few people even think about it or question it. We all know and take for granted that there's an election coming in November, that every 4 years we have to elect a president because their term ends, and there is a process using popular vote versus the Electoral College to determine who is going to be the next president of the United States. The reason we know all that is because that was set out in Article 2 of the Constitution. So, in the Constitution, 3 different parts of the government are established. There's a representative branch, which is the Congress, made up the House of the Representatives and the Senate. There is the executive branch, which is basically the presidency and all the agencies and various government entities that operate under the umbrella of the executive today. And then there is the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court and the federal court system as it has come to be established. Each of these branches has a very specific role to play. The Congress is job is to make laws, to pass bills, turn them into what we call statutes, which is one of the major ways that in the English speaking world laws are made. The Congress is made up of people that we elect. Every state has two senators, so that each state has an equal say in the Senate. And then in the House of Representatives, the number of representatives a state has is based upon their population. So Rhode Island has two representatives, California has upwards of 37. But in the Senate, California has two senators, and Rhode Island has two senators. And again, the purpose, the job of these folks is to go to Washington with our ideas, our needs, our issues, and to somehow craft laws to facilitate that. Congress also controls the budget. They control spending. No spending bills can be created unless they first start in the House of Representatives. The executive branch, made up of the president, has several roles, several hats that he plays. First of all, he is commander in chief of the military. So the president is the ultimate general. He is the ultimate head person over the Navy, the Army, the Marines, the Air Force, the Coast Guard, and now the new Space Force. He is also the diplomatic face of the United States. The State Department and all our ambassadors and all the people that go out from Washington to deal with matters with foreign governments and foreign countries are under the executive branch. So the president is head of state in that he is the person, both ceremonially and practically, will deal with foreign powers. And then finally, he is the chief executive. It is his job to execute and carry out the laws that Congress has passed and Congress has established. And again, there are a multitude, several thousand federal agencies exist today under the presidency for the purpose of carrying out the vast number of laws that Congress has created. Finally, we come to the judicial branch, set out in Article 3. And Article 3 is very interesting. It really only speaks about setting up the Supreme Court. It gives some original jurisdiction, certain types of cases that the Supreme Court can hear and can listen to, and then it leaves it up to Congress to create the rest of the court system and to determine what jurisdiction those courts will have. Now today that has grown into a whole system of federal courts, starting with the district court in every major city, and the district court is very much the court that you would see on TV and TV shows and movies. It's the court where you have juries, where you have trials, where you have hearings with witnesses, with lawyers arguing back and forth. Then there are courts of appeal, so that if you don't like what happens to you in the district court, you can seek an appeal in the next level, and finally from the courts of appeal you go up to the Supreme Court, which is the final arbiter of all things judicial and all judicial decisions in this country. There are a whole number of specialty courts, tax courts, admiralty courts, bankruptcy courts that also have been created over the years to handle various matters that the Constitution gives to the federal government. The executive does not create laws, although there have been great issues in the last 4 or 5 presidencies with something called executive orders being issued, but we'll save that for a constitutional law course. So the Congress passes laws. They attempt to create statutes. Those statutes are reviewed by the president, who has the power to veto them or to accept them. And if the president accepts them, they immediately become law. If the president vetoes them, they can go back to the Congress, and if Congress can pass them by a 2/3 vote, then the president's veto will be overridden and the item will become a law without the president's signature or approval. And then finally, the Supreme Court has aggregated to itself, beginning with the case of Marbury versus Madison in the early 1800s, that it has the authority to look at and review every law and every federal action to determine if that law, statute, action, regulation is in line with the Constitution. And the basic premise is that any item which violates the Constitution must fail, and it's the court's job to determine what those items are. There have been 2 major dramatic amendments, changes, overhauls to the original Constitution. The first was the Bill of Rights, which Actually, what happened was, in order to get the states to adopt the new constitution, they looked at it, they saw, oh my God, well, this talks all about a government and a military, but where are our rights? We fought against the King of England to have our rights protected. So it was basically a deal made that certain states would adopt the Constitution, they would ratify it, but only if the first Congress would immediately amend it by adding individual civil rights to the document. And then when the Civil War came, dramatic break, a large section of the country, nearly half of the land territory, a large number of states attempt to leave the Union to break up the government. And after a long and bloody and deadly war, the North won, and the North's position was that once you enter the Union, you could never leave. You're part of it, and so the Congress, after the Civil War, decided that they never wanted to have that happen again. They wanted to make it crystal clear, and of course, the major issue in the war that brought about the breakup of the country was what to do about slavery. And so, after the Civil War, Congress again passed three amendments that have come down into our time, having major effect on the government and how it's run and how our rights are handled. They were the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 15th Amendment that established the right to vote, and the 14th Amendment, which made all persons, first and foremost, citizens of the United States, not just of their individual state, and guaranteed that those citizens would have the right to equal protection and due process, even against their own state governments, if the state governments attempted to take those away. All right, that's all I have to say about that handout. I want to move on to one that is entitled, again, this is another handout, it's entitled Origins of Law. All right. Quick and dirty summary. The 13 colonies were established by the English. In many of them, there were actually restrictions that forbade non-English persons to immigrate here. So by the time of the Revolution, they were still principally primarily populated by Englishmen or the descendants of Englishmen. English was a primary language. And the English, when they arrived on these shores, they did not practice political correctness. They were not particularly interested in what the Aboriginal peoples or the first peoples had to do. They came with their religion and their laws, and they basically set up mini Englands in the various colonies that they created up and down the North Atlantic seacoast. So by the time the Revolution came, English law was what basically ruled and controlled in the colonies. The American Revolution was a very interesting revolution in that it did not attempt to change the social structure. The point of the revolution was to get the king and the king's army and parliament out of the colonists' business affairs and personal affairs, but at the time they were not looking to change the economic or the social structure. So once the colonies became independent, what happened was they basically kept the English legal system, court system. They changed the parliamentary system into a legislative system, and basically they rolled along taking English law. Now, in England, for 1,000 years, laws have been created in two distinct ways. First and foremost, the equivalent of our Congress or of a state legislature is the English Parliament, and very much like ours, parts of that Parliament are elected, and the elected representatives meet and they come up with ideas and they create legislation that when it's passed becomes statutes and become the law of the land, and law is created that way. The other way that law is created in the English system is through court decisions. The English courts, very early on, realized that consistency was one of the things that they needed to have if they were to have the support of the people and the respect of the people. And so, very early on, they established a principle that in English is called precedent. The Latin term for it that lawyers still use at times is called stare decisis, which means to follow or abide by the old cases. And basically, what precedent and stare decisis says is that once the courts have heard an issue and made a decision on that issue, every time that issue comes up again, they must rule the same way. They must be consistent. They can't be going back and forth, changing their ideas of what should happen in a case. Um, because of this rule, various court decisions took on the effect of law, and a whole series of laws grew up through the court system, through old court cases, in areas that Parliament had not bothered to deal with or didn't want to deal with, and this body became what's called the common law. It's a set of laws derived from the Old English cases, the Old English judges, and over time, as society got more prosperous and they could spend time on people like professors, law professors went through the old cases and attempted to pull out the rules and organize them and create the various rules for the areas of law that we know today. When we start dealing with business organizations, we're going to deal with both types of law here. A lot of the basic principles and basic definitions. What's an agent? What's an employee? What's an independent contractor? What are the duties of an employer? What are the duties of an employee? What are the rights of an employer? Large portions of that come right out of the common law. Now, on top of that, corporations come from a whole different chain of rules. Corporations are creatures of statutes. Every state and the federal government has passed statutes that allow the formation and the continuation of corporations, and some other types of entities that we'll talk about as we go along. But the basic one is a corporation, and the statutory rules and framework control how a corporation is created, operates, what it can do, what it cannot do. But corporations have agents. Corporations hire employees. Corporations act as employers. So you have this interesting melding of, even though corporations are what I would call creatures of statutory law, they still have to understand there's still a lot of the basic rules about dealing with the outside world that are covered by the common law. And as we go through the course, I will be pointing out different things, different areas to you to show you the difference between what is statutory law, what is common law. One of the things that you have to realize that our basic law comes from England through the common law, is created by statutes, either through state legislatures or Congress, and that there's a kind of unhappy blending of the two. So sometimes they don't always go together easily or well, and sometimes a lawyer's best answer when somebody comes and tells us their story and says, here's what's going on, what does the law say? Or what's going to happen? Am I going to win? And sometimes our best answer is maybe, because we need to study both sides of these laws and we need to somehow put them together to try and come up with an answer for our clients. All right, I'm going to end this and we'll continue with part 2 of this in another video.